I know most of everybody here. I'm Elizabeth Calkins. I'm our Title IX investigator. I'm sorry if you see me wrestling under the camera. I have two dachshunds in my lap. I'm trying to keep them from barking. We live downtown, right across from the jail, and there's always noise, and people live above us, and there's noise. So there you go. Let's see. So just a brief introduction. I've been at UT Tyler as the investigator for 5 years. And I also went through our clinical psychology master's program, and I specialized in neuropsychology. And one reason that I did that route is because I am very passionate about trauma response and the neurobiology of trauma and understanding what happens to the brain when you have a traumatic event, and kind of tying those two together, the brain and investigations, so trauma-informed investigations. So this is a topic that I know quite a bit about, and I'll try to keep it, not too sciencey, but sometimes that's the interesting part to me. I guess just we wanted to talk about where we sort of interact with students that have been through a traumatic event. And obviously coming to the Title IX office can be just a traumatizing process to some people, just because they don't know what to expect, even if they're not necessarily a victim or a complainant, even for the respondent, just being blamed for something that maybe they truly didn't do, or even if there was just some form of a miscommunication, but to be called into the office and they, think that they're automatically going to be blamed without any due process. So it can just be a scary kind of experience. So you definitely, you want to think of trauma response not only for someone that's a victim, but also just someone who's going through that process. Uncertainty, they could be expelled, they could be, the reputation ruined, all of these things to think about. And of course, through our process, it's all about equity. We treat everyone equitably. We make sure that they both get the things that they need through the process. Something, with trauma, we always feel like from movies or just from our own experiences that we think we know how someone that was traumatized should act. If they're not in the office, crying and, not eating and being, locked away for days, that they're not really traumatized, or they're not acting like a normal traumatized person would. And it's really important to remember that, well, especially in a Title IX sort of situation, we do tell people not to really ask a lot of questions and let us do that in the office. But if you were to encounter someone or ask questions, don't just automatically make assumptions by their actions or behaviors on whether they're credible or not. We've heard about the fight or flight reaction to something, but there's also freeze, which this goes into more of like sexual assault. But I have a lot of people that come in, complainants, and they're telling me what happened, and they say, well, I didn't move, I didn't leave the room, I didn't fight them, this is obviously my fault, or I somehow brought this on myself. And they have a lot of guilt because they didn't actually do anything. And so again, in movies, if someone is getting assaulted, they're going to be fighting and clawing them and trying to get away, but that's biologically and in the brain, that's not always what happens. And it's actually called catatonic immobility. And that's the scientific term of basically when you're faced with such a stressful situation and you've never encountered this situation before, that you just freeze. And what's happening is, your body is basically saying like, well, you don't really need to do XYZ for your survival. We need to keep you breathing. We need to keep you, doing certain things, but you don't necessarily need to run away. So, sometimes your body will just shut down the option for you to do what you normally would think that you would do in that situation. And so, definitely you don't want to make comments like, well, why didn't you just leave the room? Or why didn't you fight them? Or, well, they don't have bruises on them, so obviously that's not true. You don't ever want to make any assumptions like that, because the complainants are already thinking those things and they already have that guilt on themselves already. So it doesn't help when other people put those things on them. And especially in investigations, you don't want to, look at those behavioral. You want to look at what they're saying, what the evidence is saying, most importantly. And so just, that's just a really big thing to drive home, is that there's not going to be any typical reaction. Some people get very stoic and they can just say matter of fact what happened to them. Their body is protecting them from feeling those intense emotions. Sometimes you have, what you'd think of stereotypically, just bawling and, not eating and isolating, things like that. So there are, more or less typical things that you would see, but then there's also the non-typical that you can also see from a complainant. And another thing that's sort of coming out in the field of research is what they call fight or flight or freeze or fawning. And that's sort of a new term. But basically fawning, and I've seen this in cases before, where let's say someone comes forward and they say, I was sexually assaulted by this person. Then we have evidence that they continued to text this person, or they saw this person, went out on a date again with them, even had sex with them again. And fawning is basically just a way that they're trying to recreate some sense of safety and control and order with what happened. So, if someone was sexually assaulted, and then, they text them the next day and they're trying to, fix things or make things feel right. Even though they have that cognitive dissonance, you can't just automatically write someone off and say, well, if you went on a date with this person again, then you're obviously, it wasn't as bad as you're making it out to be. But you never know how you're going to respond to something, or how you're going to want to, again, try to create order again, try to create that sense of safety by doing those things. Again, it could be seeing that person again. We have, a lot of witnesses will come in and say, well, I saw them together the next day. Like, they were having lunch. Obviously it was fine. So, you do have to, consider all of those things as well. So it's not just the fight or flight. There's a lot of psychology and a lot of biology and stuff that goes into it. Another thing, I don't know if I'm supposed to let other people talk first or say everything I had want to say. So just tell me when you want me to stop.
You can go ahead.
Okay. Another thing, I know we talk about PTSD, for example. PTSD in the DSM is the book that has all the different diagnoses in it for mental health care. And in the DSM, it does say that, that person needed to be fearful of death or fearful of losing their life. But they're talking about now for the next possible update that they're going to broaden those considerations, because it isn't necessarily a fear for your life that has to be there, but more of the integrity of your life and what you know of your life, how it is today. So it could definitely be a national, a crisis or natural disaster. That could be, yes, you're fearing for your life. It could be domestic violence for sure. But even, really bad divorces or breakups or, anything that will just risk the integrity of your life as you know it, could have PTSD symptoms. And you could have those flashbacks or reliving, or your nervous system reacting to those things. And it's not necessarily that you're in fear for your life, but it's still challenging the way that you're navigating your world. There's a really interesting study, which is actually one of the first things that kind of got me interested in trauma. It's called the ACEs study. It's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. And basically what it is there was Kaiser Permanente. They were an insurance company. I think they might still be. But they were trying to figure out why some people were having better reactions to workout programs, and why some people would stick to it and why some people wouldn't, and why some people were doing better than others. And so it's basically just a list of questions, and they ask each participant, did you experience this as a child? And the more yeses that you give, then the more likelihood you are for things like repeated victimization or addiction, teen pregnancy, things like that. And so when we talk about, our students, we're dealing with them when they're, 18, 19, 20, 24, the range that we have in college. But when you look back at all the things that they could have already been through, starting from, age 2, so maybe they had domestic violence in the home, maybe they were abused themselves, maybe they saw drug use in the home. So when you tick all of those boxes, like by the time they get to us, they could already have, 9 items that have already been traumatizing to them and affecting their coping mechanisms and how they're navigating the world. So it's definitely interesting, when you think of them as a whole, that if they have had prior victimization, especially like sexual assault, then that is going to affect them moving forward, and how they're navigating college and things that they're going through. And, and sometimes we'll get cases that, we see it on the surface. It's like, well, it doesn't really seem like it's that serious of an offense, maybe, a harassment or something, that maybe it doesn't rise to the level of sexual harassment, or maybe it was just a comment that we see as being taken in the wrong, maybe just taken incorrectly. But for that person, maybe this is the 5th time they've had something traumatic happen to them, or something similar happen to them in the past with a different outcome. And so for us to say, well, that's not really that big of a deal, like you can't do that. You have to look at it from their perspective and think about things that they through. So it takes a lot of, introspection and understanding of those things to not just automatically, jump to a conclusion, which is why they actually, I think it was 2019, it was before the pandemic, but I don't remember if it was 19 or 20, UT system actually introduced a new policy that all of the police departments have to have trauma-informed training. And so, and I went to interrogation school in 2017 or 18, I can't remember which. And we were learning read interrogation, and I actually had spoken with some law enforcement officers that were from smaller towns in the area. I think we were in Houston. But they sat across the table from me and said, well, if she doesn't say no, then, I don't believe that this person was assaulted. Like, if they don't fight back, then I don't believe them. And it was shocking. So there's still that what we call like old school policing. There's definitely out there. And that's why this sort of education is really important, because, these people are already being traumatized initially, and then they come in and then they could be re-traumatized more and more. And so just having that understanding that it's not really about like what we think is offensive or what we think is traumatizing, but looking at their history as a whole, and saying, if that's your truth, then I honor that. And, just looking at it from a different perspective, just switching the lens. And, it might come out later that potentially, maybe that person was making something up, or maybe that person was, it was a misunderstanding or whatnot. But it's always better to act on the side of caution and compassion up front, and then to be later, well, I guess, I was incorrect. So it's definitely, you want to consider all of those things. If anyone's interested in the neurobiology of trauma, Dr. Rebecca Campbell, she is the the best researcher. She's from University of Michigan. She pretty much introduced the neurobiology of trauma, but she talks a lot about how your brain is, when you're traumatized, it's a bunch of little sticky notes of memories. And so you stick a little sticky note all over, you have all these sticky notes. And then when you come in for an interview, for an investigation, you're supposed to take all of these sticky notes and put them in this chronological perfect order that makes sense. And she talks about how, that's just impossible for someone to be able to do that, because if you take all those sticky notes and you put them and you shake them all up, they're going to be all stuck to each other, they're going to be all out of order. So it's really interesting. Do you want to learn about that? She talks a lot about the neurochemicals, and there's been some cases where someone was sexually assaulted and she didn't remember, where she was or who the person was or anything. But the only thing that she could remember was that she heard train tracks or train noises. And that's because, you know, like her system had shut down a lot of things other than like your sense of smell can get very strong in a traumatic experience, or your sense of hearing. And so they were actually able to narrow down like where this apartment was and who this person was that assaulted her, just based off of the proximity to like a train depot station. So, you know, when you're interviewing someone, so asking questions about, well, did you hear anything, or did you see, you know, smell anything, taste anything, and just kind of working off of tips, because you can actually get a lot from your senses. So I think that's everything I was going to say. I had in my notes, but, you know, if anybody has questions about any of that, or do you have anything else you want me to talk about later, I probably can think of more.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. I hadn't heard of fawning, so
Yeah.
that's,
Yes. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense, I'm sure, with what you've seen. In
yeah,
practice.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I've seen it, but I didn't know it had a name.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
guess.
Fawning. Like I said, it's pretty new, but, and I've seen it in investigations, and Blake, Dave, I'm sure we've all seen it. If we, but it's just, we all kind of want things to be in order, and we all want control of things. And when they're not, any way that you can try to do that, you know, it makes sense.
Yeah, you're kind of trying to reframe it, change the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
make and not it see yourself as a victim. You see, like, well, I was a willing participant in this. You know, this didn't happen to me. Like, I let this happen, kind of thing. So,
yeah. So you hit on a lot of things, and some things I was gonna bring up too. So just like, no, you're fine. No, that's great. We were on the same page is more how I meant that. So I think a lot of people, whenever they think of traumatic stuff or PTSD, they think of like war or sexual assault, but there's a lot of other things, like you mentioned, growing up in an abusive household. I do see that.
Yeah, and there are even a lot of, there's all of emerging research now about bullying, even just, you know, bullying in middle school, elementary school, about how bullying can have such an effect, which is important, you know, because for bullying and like hazing and campaigns and things like that, it does affect long-term bullying is another thing. So it can be traumatizing.
Sometimes, I was just going to say, sometimes I had a case where the student was unconscious during the traumatic event, but they still had PTSD. And the student they didn't think there was anything wrong because they couldn't remember the incident itself, but they still were going through, I mean, it was like they had a checklist of PTSD symptoms. So sometimes someone can be traumatized and not recognize it until those symptoms start to come up.
Yeah, there's go ahead.
Oh, but
I was saying there's a book called The Body Remembers, and that's about how your body will hold in trauma and how you can have, you know, effects of trauma, you know, long after, or just you don't realize there are trauma responses. But if you're, you know, you get scared easily, or if you get sweaty when you see something, you know, whatever. So yeah, definitely, the body is very smart when it comes to trauma.
Yes, I will sometimes, every once in a while, I'll have a client who does not remember their childhood hardly at all, you know, but they do have a lot of the traumatic, you know, responses and stuff. And of course, like that does go back to the brain not being able to be not encoding memories the way it normally would because of, you know, everything that's going on. So whenever people have been through something traumatic, I think a lot of them will feel really weird about how the world can just, you know, the world just goes on around them, you know, and their world has completely changed. And so just kind of be validating that for them, you know, if you run across someone who's been through something traumatic recently. You might also see somebody that's kind of a ghost of their former self, kind of half there, kind of out of it because of that. There's like a numbness factor there. And a lot of capacity, I think, is just spent on trying to suppress and kind of avoid thinking about what all they've been through, but it takes a lot of energy, and so there's not much left for them, you know, and they can feel like a ghost of their former self too, you know, because they've been so profoundly changed by what happened. And a lot of people will come across as quote unquote fine on the surface. So there's kind of this layer effect where you might see, yeah, they're smiling, but their eyes are sad, you know?
Yeah.
And covering up has just become a way of life to where they might not necessarily recognize the full extent of how affected they've been. It's
Yeah, and I think
many
too
will,
with that. Okay.
yeah, I was gonna
was gonna
say,
say-
like, sorry. Many will insist that they're fine and it wasn't such a big deal to them, or like they'll say stuff like, yeah, and I realize, like, yeah, if somebody gets raped, like that's a big deal, but really to me, like, it wasn't that big of a deal, you know, like, and they'll try to insist that. So I think that goes back to that avoidance, and this idea of like, oh, I can get over this, but you don't really get over trauma. Like, it does leave its imprint on you, but they don't maybe want to recognize that now things really have changed. And that's not to say you can't get to a point where you are functioning well, you know, in the future. But in order to really get there, you have to process through and actually talk about what happened, which can be very, very difficult, especially at first. And so, yeah, those are my little tidbits for now.
Yeah, what I was gonna say is, I think, you know, it's everyone's expected to just be fine all the time, or when something traumatic happens. I feel like it's kind of a culture thing, and then if you could work on that in your own offices of making it an area where people can be vulnerable, or people can talk about what's bothering them. If you notice something is wrong and you ask, you know, to make it where they know, well, this person actually wants to know, this person actually cares about me. You know, I don't know how many cases we get that are referred from Dave, and they say Dave was amazing, Dave was so helpful, Dave called, you know, checked on me. You know, so just having that environment in your area where you do interact with that, not only, you know, are they willing to share, but that they know, like, this is a safe place to share, and this person really cares about what I have to say. Because I feel like that's sort of our culture, that we just are supposed to put on a brave face and, yeah, everything's fine, and, you know, I don't want to inconvenience anyone by talking about something that's traumatic. It's like they're uncomfortable, and so that means for me, like, I can't be myself, or I can't share. So just something to keep in mind, that, you know, when we see the students, they're dealing with a lot of things, not just, you know, school and classes.
One thing that some students that I've worked with have told me is that when they do start to disclose, the thing that made it easier for them was that I didn't freak out.
Mm-hmm.
Which is easier said than done sometimes, because some of them will tell you some horrific stuff.
Yeah.
But if and it's not that you're downplaying it or acting like it's not a big deal, but if you can maintain composure and, you know, just respond like, wow, that sounds like it was really hard. How are you holding up? You know, do you want to talk about it further? By not freaking out, you take away some of its power, and
Yeah.
you make it safer and more comfortable for them to talk about it. And, you know, sometimes it's things in their childhood, sometimes it's, you know, sexual assaults, sometimes it was, you know, it's accidents. You know, I mean, my experience with PTSD was when a newspaper delivery truck crashed into my bedroom. So, you know, there can be all kinds of things that you would not expect. The one thing that I have, and I keep learning it year after year after year, is that some people are scary good at acting like everything's fine. The I have had students that, and intellectually, I know we have no idea what people are going through, but until they start talking, I would never, just by brief interactions, I would never have guessed what they were dealing with, and how some of them are able to function months or years after the fact.
Mhm.
And just you would never know it until they get someplace safe and can actually start talking about it.
Very true.
Bruce, did you want to share? Bruce is our recovery guy. Did you want to share what you've seen, or if your perspective from your area?
Sure. I'll say that there's not a whole lot that I can add. I think, Elizabeth, you did a great job of describing the ACEs study. I think that's one of the most important things that informs how we conduct ourselves in recovery spaces. And it's interesting to learn that the more common thing is to have one or more adverse childhood events in your life. It's more common than having none at all. So trauma is definitely something that we see with folks that are in recovery. A lot of the research suggests that people who have had some type of trauma are more likely, or there's a correlation between having some type of trauma in the past and developing some type of substance use disorder. So that needs to be, part of how we inform our recovery care and, and treatment and things like that. So not really a whole lot to add. Trauma is something that's extremely common amongst the recovery community. And even once we get into recovery spaces, trauma is, something that a lot of us cling to as a coping mechanism. It becomes both what causes or leads to the problem in the first place and what we seek as a solution, either through traumatizing other people or re-traumatizing ourselves. And it may seem crazy to those who've never been in any type of recovery situation or had to deal with a substance use disorder or anything like that. It can be very strange. And even for someone in recovery who may have had their own lived experience, to see some of the reactions that individuals have, because trauma is such an individual experience, seeing the way that other people react and thinking, well, that's not how I reacted, that must be wrong. It's easy to make those types of value judgments about what's right and wrong. But again, I didn't want to take up too much time talking. I was hoping to open the floor, and I don't know if anyone else had anything prepared that they wanted to share, but I hope that we can make this a bit of a conversation. And I'd be happy to I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone has about our specific population.
I think that, can I jump in?
Yes, please.
I think Elizabeth did an excellent job of, how we recognize trauma. That's the first step is, recognizing that trauma is there and how we use it in our investigations. The thing that troubles me is, recognizing it's the first step. How do we, other than kind words and being nice and supportive, what more can we do to support those students that are going through trauma? My first introduction to trauma-informed investigations was when I joined UT Tyler here in 2015 as the Title IX coordinator, which is sad because I had been in higher education law enforcement since 1995 and had never had the conversation about trauma-informed investigation. So I know I'm kind of dating myself. As Elizabeth mentioned, that's no longer the case. There is a new law where PDs are required to have trauma-informed investigation techniques, but that was not something that we talked about. So in my previous, positions, we dealt a lot with students in crisis. We didn't use the word trauma. We always use students in crisis intervention, but we never really discussed when crisis crosses that line into trauma. Most crises do cause trauma of some sort. And what we always talked about in dealing with students in crisis was addressing the immediate safety needs, making sure this person's in a safe place, mitigating any other safety risks, but we never really addressed, okay, we've got you in a safe place, you're good to go. And then, you know, I'm not checking it up on you 10 years down the road or 5 years down the road or, you know, anything like that. But it's so important, you know, you talk about our core pillars of our institution, and student retention is one of those, you know. And I know there was a presentation back whenever we were doing our, back when we were doing what was it, the academic, what was it, the university mission, back when we were doing that whole process and we were having the town halls and everything. There was part of the presentation was reasons on why people leave the university. Well, you know, what affects student retention? You know, finance was up there. A large number, and it most likely underreported, is the numbers of folks that leave that just list personal reasons, you know, for leaving. And so many of those are students that are suffering from trauma of one sort or another. So in our office, you know, whenever we start talking about reasonable accommodations, you know, how can we provide academic accommodations, working accommodations, counseling services, you know, all these resources that we have available to students, you know, recognizing and I guess treating trauma as something that is deserving of a reasonable accommodation. And I don't think that a lot of students that are going through trauma realize that you know, they could request accommodations for trauma. So, you know, getting that message out to students and faculty and staff, and being able to actually put into place accommodations that would help them. How do we get to that level, you know?
Which luckily we have a lot of resources, not only at UT Tyler, but in our community as well. So, you know, it's just a matter of plugging the students into that. And, you know, that's another thing with trauma is you could say, well, you can call the counseling center and get free counseling. And they say, okay, but they don't always call. They don't always, and when you, like Linda said, when they're trying to survive with trauma, you know, they can't always juggle as many things as they used to be able to. And so the follow through sometimes is missing. And so, you know, being that person that says, you know, like, I'll walk down to the counseling center with you if you want, and we can make an appointment, or I'll call the Title IX office and set up the appointment for you, you know, if you want me to do that. So just remembering that, you know, just because they say they're fine and that they're going to follow through with these items, you know, they might barely be, you know, waking up and eating, and that's really all they can do with their day. And, you know, so to take that next step and get the services and things that they need.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the major problems that we see is they don't seek help until they failed. You know, they're usually when we get those accommodation requests that are the result of trauma, you know, they're depressed, they haven't been going to class, they haven't been turning things in. It's because now I've failed and I need that help, you know. And so how do we reach those students at an earlier stage in their trauma to provide those accommodations so that they don't fall behind, they don't get to that point where the only option is a medical withdrawal, you know.
Right.
We've had a lot of, we have had some really good luck with faculty who catch that there's something up. Performance starts to decline, they stop attending, and when those faculty notify, say, the care team early, a lot of times we can, you know, get the student some help. And there's a lot of cases where it's severe enough that, you know, the student legitimately needs to pursue a medical withdrawal. So we do have things that are available, but the sooner we can work with someone, the better. Does anyone know if there's any good research or numbers out there for how, and I think Elizabeth or Linda, one of you may have mentioned this, but how many of our students are dealing with some form of trauma?
As far as specific numbers or
what we could expect. I mean, I know what I see, but I'm curious if there's better data than just my observation.
I don't have any actual data on that.
Yeah, another reason to update our clay survey, because they do ask about those, different types of victimizations, which we know previously it was dating and domestic violence was the #1 on our campus. But I don't know of any.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the CLACE results, you're looking at victimization rates total for the college, of upwards of 30% have been
30%.
in one form or another suffered some sort of victimization, and that's only Title IX. And so when we're talking about trauma, and we're talking about that broad spectrum, and that only includes instances that occurred since they've been here at the university. It's easy to see that the numbers could be double that.
Yeah, and anyone who knows me knows I talk about this a lot. On average, I probably walk about 1 or 2 students a week down to the counseling center or Title IX or both.
Yeah.
And a lot of those cases, though, it's stuff that happened before they got here.
Mhm.
Yep. So we got a question Maggie asked. I think
Yeah.
the double-edged sword is that they leave for personal reasons, then we don't catch the survey because they're gone, right? If the challenge, if they put that down, is unless they have contacted us some other way, we won't. It's really hard to say that they left for this specific reason. Personal reasons could be a lot of things.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is stuff that they probably don't want to talk about. And that's the insidious thing about a lot of the trauma. The way you heal from it is you talk about it in a therapeutic setting. But what makes some of this, especially the sexually based ones, so traumatic is it basically conditions you to not want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I think that's a big chunk of the reason why a lot of the cases that I'm aware of, it's things that happened months or years earlier before they really talk about it.
Right.
And I would say, adding to that, yes, there are some traumatic things, that you can talk about much more easily, like a car accident,
Yeah.
And so I think the very hardest for students to talk about is childhood sexual abuse.
Mhm.
In my experience, I feel like it's that is harder even than talking about a sexual assault. And I'm talking about like actually giving details,
Yeah.
as people would do, in counseling. That's
and I think
hard resistance there.
I think college and university setting is unique in the sense that sometimes this is the first time the students are away from the family, and sometimes this is maybe the first time they've ever had services of any kind to go talk to a counselor or go talk to someone online, especially individuals coming from like a rural area. There's just not a lot of opportunity for them to share. And so, or they think if they do share, it's going to come back on their family, or it's going to look bad in their family. And so it's like a unique setting that this may be the first time that they're ever really able to talk about it.
And when I first started out in the field and I would hear about childhood sexual abuse and how they may have actually reached out typically to their mom and disclosed what had happened. The mom, a lot of times they were not believed by their mom. And I would think like, oh, that's horrible. Like this must be an exception, but hearing about it more and more and thinking it through, because it's, people get parents, we, as a society, not necessarily me, would get worried about like the stranger in the alley type scenario or somebody hiding in a public restroom or whatever. But you don't think about your family members. But it's a lot of times it's like it's a stepfather or an uncle or grandfather. So if you think about it from the mother's perspective, then that's potentially their spouse, their dad, their brother, and so it's just very difficult for people to believe that could actually be something their family member is capable of doing. So it's kind of easier for them to be like, oh, you probably imagined it, or I misunderstood, because they're not necessarily coming to you with like a detailed story if they're 5 years old or something like that. And so, so I think that's something just to be aware of. So it's not necessarily typical or the most common, but I do hear from students a lot that, you know, that was their only other time that they disclosed, and then now they're disclosing to me, you know. And so yeah, some students carry around like these things that happened, you know, 10 years ago or so, and you know, just still have kind of that child's perspective on it. And it can be very helpful for them to like, okay, do you have like a 5-year-old that's around that you could go and just kind of spend time with and observe? And I think once they realize like, oh, there's no way, you know, that if something were to happen to this child, that it would be the child's fault. Like they can really see like how easy it would be for someone to take advantage of a child that age. And so, so yeah, that's one aspect I see students carrying, is just like this idea that there could have been something they could have done.
Yeah.
And so, and I think even, I mean, I have a 9-year-old son. Even at that age, I feel like he could easily be taken advantage of, you know, by someone. So that's something that can sometimes help people get perspective, is just to observe children, because they remember, you know, their childhood is like because they felt like they had more control than they actually did. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another thing, as far as, you know, like faculty, staff, the people that are here today are probably here because they are more in tune with services that we offer on campus or things that are going on. But I think it is important, especially if a student did disclose to you and then you were kind of just like, well, I'm sorry that happened to you, you know, like instead of saying like, well, did you know we have this service and this service? So I think definitely knowing all the things that we do offer, you know, like the recovery or counseling, the care team, Title IX, the vet service. There's so many opportunities and things on campus and in our community. The crisis center is amazing. The PD is amazing. They're able to help with, you know, protective orders, and we can help with, you know, emergency housing, anything like that. So definitely knowing what we offer on campus is really important, and also in the community. So instead of just being like, oh, I'm sorry, you know, you can say, you know, well, this might help you, you know, XYZ. And so knowing what to do once that person discloses to you is also really important, because like Linda said, they might not really tell that many people. And if they tell you and then you kind of mess up that opportunity or miss that opportunity, then, you know, that could have, you know, trails and ripples effect into what they do next.
So you're saying that if we did hear that a student had prior trauma and they were having trouble coping, that any of those areas would be a good place to start, like counseling would be a good place to start?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and that's what I was thinking, you know, but yeah, thanks.
And pretty much any of those areas, if it's not the exact right one, they can get the student and at least get the process started.
Right.
You know, like I had a student, you know, a couple of weeks ago had, you know, the issue, it was a Title IX issue. And so, you know, they kind of talked through what was going on. And, you know, I wrote the report while they were here, and then Title IX got it from there. And, you know, they were already in the process of getting it with counseling. You know, sometimes it's walking them over to a specific office, but any one of us can start the process. And, you know, if, you know, once I get to the point where I'm like, okay, I've done what I can effectively, but here's the other stuff that I know the student needs, And, I try to do the referral in a way to where they know, okay, this is the next step. I'm not just getting passed off to somebody.
Right. Yeah, and I know back when we did the CLAY survey, that was basically a climate survey where they asked students, this was from UT System, they asked students, different types of victimizations and different type of demographics. And one of the questions was, did I believe that my university would do something about this? Or did I trust my university to do something? And it was a pretty large number. And this was right when Blake and I came and started the Title IX office. So before it was just, duties as assigned for Title IX, and they did a great job, but just saying it wasn't as promoted things as it is now. But it was really sad that it was such a high number that the students said that they did not think that the university would help. And I think Blake and I, just speaking for Title IX, like we really do a good job at, being compassionate and helping the students, and not just, like Dave said, just kind of passing it off. And that's one thing that's really good about our university that I love, is that I trust any of the people that I would send a student to do as good of a job with them in that sense as I would do. If I sent somebody to Bruce, or if I sent someone to Dave, like I know that they would go above and beyond to get whatever that student needed. And I think that's a really good thing about our university, is that we really do have a lot of staff and faculty that really do care about the students, and we'll make sure, and I trust, that the people I work with to do the same job that I would do.
I think too, getting the word out to students about making care reports, because we normally would get care reports from staff or faculty or RAs, not as much from peers. And I think peers really know, what's really going on a lot of the time, even more so.
One thing I do recommend, if you do refer a student to one of our areas, whether it's walking them over or calling them or however, do follow up with the student roughly a week or so later, just to see how they're doing. Sometimes something happened on the way and they may need just a little bit more encouragement.
Mm-hmm.
If nothing else, just that contact just reinforces that you care about them. It reinforces that they're not alone, and it makes it easier for them to continue the process of disclosure, which is really the main thing they need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there is a lot of, people that just from watching the media, they think, well, if I report this, nothing's going to happen, and so then when they do report and something does happen and they are seen and valued and followed up with, and then they're like, oh, okay, well, like that went better than I thought it would, I thought it was going to go. And I know Blake and I have had people come back or send emails or, texts and be like, thank you so much. You changed the path that this was all going. And I really appreciate you. I'm now, I took some time off. I'm back in school, or whatever. And it's like, one thing that you do, it just, out of, human being to human being, and seeing them and listening to them can really make a big difference, bigger than you might think in just a normal interaction, just your job, So.
One of the seemingly unrelated things that can have a huge ripple effect, I know Elizabeth mentioned ripple effect, is student engagement and getting our students in, making sure that every student is involved in something, some student organization, because, when we do get concerned reports, we tend to have a higher number of reports from those that are involved in other activities, whether it's athletics or Greek life or an academic organization or a major, organization or something like that. Because the more a student is involved, the more there are people around them who recognize when something's wrong, and so that's, as we mentioned, students are often very reluctant to reach out for help on their own victimization. And it is more likely that we'll get a report either from a faculty staff member, or if we have them involved in student organizations, we're going to get a report from somebody in that student organization if there's a concern here. And that allows us to be able to reach out to them quicker. So, it's seemingly not related, but it really is. You know, anything that we can do to help with student engagement, student activities, getting students involved, it's going to have that ripple effect to a better caring environment and a better reporting environment.
Did anyone have any questions for any one of us?
Yeah, one thing I would leave everyone with is I went into a lot of this thinking that you needed really specialized training to be of any real help in a situation like this. And I recognize that I'm not the person who's going to be able to actually do the therapy with them, but just getting them comfortable with disclosing, making sure they know the resources, helping them get connected with those resources is a huge, huge deal, because a lot of these students effectively need someone to give them permission to do this. And it really just being engaged with them and caring about them and what they have to say is really what starts that process. And any of us can do that.